For Lee, this same Sunday had been a day of puzzlement, mounting tension, and frustration. He not only did not know of the early morning switch in Blue commanders, he did not even know that for the past 2 days the whole Federal Army had been on the same side of the Potomac as his own. Such ignorance might have been expected to be the opposite of disturbing. A maxim even described it as bliss, except that, as he knew only too well, having had occasion to prove it to several opponents, a lack of information was all too often the prelude to disaster. A recent prime example of this was Hooker, of whom Jackson had said on the ride to Guinea Station, "He should not have sent away his cavalry. That was his great blunder. It was that which enabled me to turn him without his being aware of it, and to take him by the rear." Now Lee himself was in somewhat the same danger, and for somewhat the same reason. For the better part of a week he'd heard nothing at all from Stuart, on whom he'd always depended for information, or from any of his 6 brigades. One was at Carlisle with Ewell, approaching the Susquehanna. 2 were guarding the Blue Ridge passes far to the south, while the other 3, presumably, were off on another of those circumferential rides that had brought fame to their plumed leader. This last was not in itself the reason for Lee's anxiety. After all, he himself had authorized the adoption of such a course. What bothered him was the silence, which was as complete as if a soundproof curtain had been dropped between him and his one best source of information. Scarcely an officer who approached him there in Shutter's Woods today escaped the question, "Can you tell me where General Stuart is?" Or, "Where on earth is my cavalry?" Or even, "Have you any news of the enemy's movements? What is the enemy going to do?" No one had ever heard him ask such things before, for the simple reason that he had never needed to ask them. Stuart had generally supplied the answers in advance. And now, for lack of answers, he was obliged, as most of his opponents to their distress in the course of the past year had been obliged, to fall back on uninformed conjecture. This summoned up a host of alarming possibilities, including the danger that the Bluecoats might be contemplating an attack on thinly defended Richmond, or on his even more thinly defended supply line in the Cumberland Valley, both of which maneuvers had in fact been proposed by Hooker and disallowed by Lincoln. One would be about as unwelcome to Lee as the other in the present dispersed condition of his army, 1/3 of which was a good 40 miles from Chambersburg, where the remaining 2/3 were in profitless bivouac and so completely stripped of cavalry that the foraging was being done by soldiers mounted on horses from the artillery and the wagon train. However, for all his inward anxiety, which he masked as best he could behind a show of being calm and even cheerful, Lee not only let his disposition stand, he sent word for Ewell to continue the advance on Harrisburg and prepared to move the rest of his army in that direction the following day, first Longstreet and then Hill, both of whom were put on the alert. "If the enemy does not find us," he explained, "we must try to find him in the absence of the cavalry as best we can." So he said, continuing the attempt to mask his growing concern. But he still asked all comers, "Can you tell me where General Stuart is? And where on earth is my cavalry?" Perhaps it was just as well, so far at least as his temper was concerned, that no one within range of his voice could give him the answer, which was not of a nature to relieve his qualms. In fact, it might well have upset him more than did the tantalizing silence. For even as he inquired of various callers as to the whereabouts of his cavalry on this Sunday afternoon, Stuart and the more than 5,000 troopers of his 3 best brigades were on the northeast fringe of Washington, some 70 miles away. That was as the crow flew, moreover, and for anyone but a crow it would have been considerably farther, not only because Jeb had no more notion of Lee's whereabouts than Lee had of his, but also because a good many of those intervening miles were occupied by the Federal Army, which Lee mistakenly assumed to be still south of the Potomac, but which in fact was being alerted even now for a resumption of its northward march at dawn. This meant that Stuart would face tomorrow the same frustration he had faced today, and indeed for the past 3 days as well, in attempting to carry out his instructions to make contact with the right flank of the Confederate Army of Invasion. Hooker had stood in his path, and so would Meade. It had been that way from the outset. Just after midnight, June 24th, when he first left Salem and moved east beyond the Bull Run Mountains to find a heavy column of blue infantry marching squarely athwart the route he had chosen for what was intended to be not only the greatest of all his rides, but also indemnity for the ugly things some of the Southern papers had been saying about him ever since the surprise they claimed he'd suffered a couple of weeks ago at Brandy Station. His plan, based on information that the Bluecoats were inactive in their camps east of the mountains and were scattered over so wide an area that he'd be able to push his way between two of their corps in order to get beyond them for a crossing of the Potomac in their rear, had been workable the day before when the information was true, but it was true no longer. By coincidence, Hooker began his northward march to the Potomac shortly before Stuart emerged from Glasscock's Gap on the morning of June 25th, and that was how it happened that Jeb found his progress blocked by a whole corps of Federals in motion across his front. Promptly he unlimbered the 6 guns he'd brought along and began to shell the passing column, which extended north and south for a greater distance than the eye could follow. He thus was mindful of Lee's instructions to do the enemy all the damage you can, but the admonition included in the same letter that he was not to attempt his favorite maneuver unless he found he could do so without hindrance was ignored. Turning off to the south, he camped for the night near Buckland, intending to swing wide around the enemy rear next morning. However, dawn showed the Federals gone, and he rode east through Bristow and Brentsville, not sighting a single Bluecoat all day long, to bivouac just south of Occoquan Creek, which he crossed at Wolf Run Shoals next morning, June 27th. In better than 50 hours, he'd covered less than 40 miles of road, and he was about as far from the nearest Potomac ford as he'd been when he started. Moreover, horses and men were beginning to show how hard they'd been worked these past 2 weeks, fending off the aggressive blue troopers at such places as Middleburg and Aldie before undertaking their present exertions deep in the enemy rear. Frequent halts were necessary for rest and feeding, no matter how Stuart chafed when he remembered that his orders had been to cross the Potomac as soon as practicable after the 24th, 3 days ago. Pressing northward, first through Fairfax Station, where he captured most of a 100-man detachment of New York cavalry, and then to Fairfax Courthouse, where he called a halt to let his hungry troopers go through several sutler shacks and graze their horses, he struck the Leesburg-Alexandria Turnpike and turned left along it for Drainesville, which he reached soon after sundown. Smoldering campfires were evidence that Federal infantry had recently passed this way and were still in the vicinity guarding the better Potomac fords upstream. So he swung due north for a crossing at Rouser's Ford, which was deep and wide and booming. No more difficult achievement was accomplished by the cavalry during the war, a staff officer later declared. The guns went completely out of sight, and the ammunition was distributed among the men who kept it above water by carrying it over in their arms. By 3 o'clock in the morning, June 28th, as Meade awoke to find Hardee standing beside his cot, the entire command, one member said, stood wet and dripping on the Maryland shore. Stuart let his troopers sleep till dawn, then resumed the march, mindful of his orders to take position on General Ewell's right, place yourself in communication with him, guard his flank, keep him informed of the enemy's movements, and collect all the supplies you can for the use of the army. The trouble was he did not know Ewell's position any more than he knew Lee's, except that Ewell would probably move toward the Susquehanna. Jeb's decision to move in that direction, too, was easily arrived at. The whole Union Army was to the west. The heavily manned Washington defenses were to the east. All that was left, unless he gave the project up and retraced his steps southward, which apparently never crossed his mind, was north, and that was the way he went. By midday, he was in Rockville, a town on the National Road which ran from Washington through Frederick, present headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, and thence on out to Ohio. Rockville was thus on the main Federal supply route, and scouts reported a train of 150 mule-drawn wagons on the way there from the capital, whose outskirts were less than a dozen miles away. Soon they came in sight, and the raiders bore down on them, whooping in hungry anticipation of a feast. The wagons were brand new, the mules fat and sleek, and the harness in use for the first time, one trooper later wrote. Such a train we'd never seen before and did not see again. Though almost half were captured at that first swoop, the other teamsters got their wagons turned around and took off down the road at a hard trot. For a time it looked as if they might be able to outrun the weary rebel horses, but presently a wagon overturned and caused a pileup, blocking the road for all but about 24 of the others, whose drivers continued their race for safety, still pursued until the Gray Riders came within full view of Washington itself and abandoned the chase. Even without the ones that got away, the spoils were rich, including 400 teamsters, 900 mules, and 125 wagons loaded with hams, bacon, sugar, hardtack, bottled whiskey, and enough oats to feed the 5,000 half-starved mounts of the raiders for several days. Much time was spent at Rockville, paroling the prisoners, feeding the horses, and accepting the admiring glances of some young ladies from a local seminary who came out waving improvised Confederate flags and requesting souvenir buttons. While all this was going on, Stuart toyed with the notion of making a quick dash into the northern capital, but then rejected it regretfully, for lack of time, he subsequently explained, and resumed his northward march at sundown, hampered somewhat by the 125 best United States model wagons and splendid teams with gay caparisons, which he was determined to turn over to Lee as a sort of super trophy of the ride when and if he managed to find him. A 20-mile night march brought the raiders into Cooksville, where they captured another detachment of blue cavalry on the morning of June 29th before pushing on to Hood's Mill, a station on the B&O about midway between Baltimore and Frederick. While further disrupting the Federal lines of supply and communication by tearing up the tracks there and burning a bridge at Sykeston, 3 miles east, Stuart inquired of friendly Marylanders as to Ewell's whereabouts. None of them could tell him anything, but newspapers just in from the north reported Confederate infantry at York and Carlisle, moving against Wrightsville and Harrisburg. So Jeb pressed on to Westminster, 15 miles north on the turnpike connecting Gettysburg and Baltimore. Arriving in the late afternoon, he gobbled up another mounted blue detachment and made camp for the night. Scouts brought word that Union cavalry was in strength at Littleton, 12 miles ahead and just beyond the Pennsylvania line. Next morning, it was now the last day of June, the 6th he'd spent out of touch with the rest of the army. He took the precaution of placing Fitz Lee on the left of the column, assigned Hampton to guard the captured wagons, and rode in the lead with John R. Chambliss, successor to the wounded Rooney Lee. His immediate objective, another 15 miles to the north, was Hanover, where he'd be able to choose between two good roads, one leading northwest to Carlisle and the other northeast to York, for a hookup with one or the other of Ewell's reported columns of invasion. What he encountered first at Hanover, however, was a fight. It was an unequal affair, the enemy force amounting to no more than a single brigade, but what the Blue Horsemen lacked in numbers, they made up for in vigor. A sudden charge struck and shattered the head of the Gray Column, and Stuart himself was obliged to take a 15-foot ditch jump to avoid being captured along with his blooded mare, Virginia. I shall never forget the glimpse I then saw of this beautiful animal away up in midair over the chasm, a staff officer later wrote, and Stuart's fine figure sitting erect and firm in the saddle. Bringing up reserves, Jeb drove off the attackers, who in turn were reinforced by another brigade. No serious fighting ensued, however, for while the Federals seemed content to block the road to Gettysburg, a dozen miles to the west, Stuart wanted only to take the road to York, 20 miles to the northeast. After some desultory long-range firing, the two forces drew apart, the Confederates still hampered by the train of captured wagons and some 400 prisoners taken here and elsewhere in the past 2 days since leaving Rockville, where the previous 400 had been paroled. This called for another night march, and the riders who made it remembered it ever after as a nightmare. It is impossible for me to give you a correct idea of the fatigue and exhaustion of the men and beasts, a lieutenant afterward said. Even in line of battle, in momentary expectation of being made to charge, the men would throw themselves upon their horses' necks and even to the ground and fall asleep. Couriers, in attempting to give orders to officers, would be compelled to give them a shake and a word before they could make them understand. Reaching Dover soon after dawn of the hot first day of July, Stuart learned to his chagrin that there were no Confederates at York, 6 miles east. They had been there 2 days ago, but now they were gone, and no one would say where. So he turned the head of the column hard left toward Carlisle, 25 miles northwest, supposing that Ewell had ordered a concentration there. He was wrong, as he discovered when he approached the town that afternoon and found it occupied by Pennsylvania militia, who peremptorily rejected his demand for a surrender. Jeb and his road-worn troopers were in no shape for a fight, even with raw home guardsmen, one of his officers frankly admitted. Weak and helpless as we were, he wrote home later, our anxiety and uneasiness were painful indeed. Thoughts of saving the wagons now were gone, and we thought only of how we ourselves might escape. Contenting himself with a token long-range shelling of the U.S. cavalry barracks, the plumed commander was at a loss for a next move until well after nightfall, when two scouts who had left the column near York, with instructions to search westward for signs of the army, reported back to Stuart outside Carlisle. They had found Lee in the main body that day at Gettysburg, where a battle was in progress, and Lee had sent them to find and summon the long-absent Jeb, who thus was placed in the unusual position of having the Army commander report to him the location of the infantry he had been ordered to get in touch with and protect. At 1 o'clock in the morning, July 2nd, 1 week to the hour since he first set out on the ride that was designed in part to retrieve his slipping reputation, Stuart had his troopers on the march for Gettysburg, which was 30 miles away by the nearest road. This was their fifth night march in the past 8 days, and it was perhaps the hardest of them all. Southward the weary horses plodded, over Yellow Britches Creek, through Mount Holly Pass, and across the rolling farmland of Adams County, of which Gettysburg was the county seat. The riders were so exhausted, it was noted, that one who tumbled from his mount slept sprawled across the fence that broke his fall. At dawn they still had miles to go, and even the indefatigable Jeb, though he still clung tenaciously to the train of captured wagons as the one substantial trophy of his ride, could see that a rest halt had to be called if he was to arrive with more than a remnant of his 3 brigades. It was late afternoon before he reached the field of the greatest battle of the war, having missed all of the first day and most of the second. Lee received him with an iciness which a staff officer found painful beyond description. Reddening at the sight of his chief of cavalry, the gray commander raised one arm in a menacing gesture of exasperation. "General Stuart, where have you been?" he said. "I have not heard a word from you in days, and you the eyes and ears of my army." Jeb wilted under this unfamiliar treatment and became so flustered that he played his trump card at the outset. "I've brought you 125 wagons and their teams, General," he announced. Only to have Lee reply, "Yes, General, but they are an impediment to me now." Then suddenly Lee softened. Perhaps it was Stuart's obvious dismay, or his somewhat bedraggled appearance after 8 days in the saddle, or perhaps it was a recollection of all the service this young man had done him in the past. At any rate, a witness recalled years later, Lee's manner became one of great tenderness as he added, "Let me ask your help now. We will not discuss this longer. Help me fight these people." The reason Stuart had encountered none of Ewell's men at York or Carlisle the day before, or Wednesday, was that Lee, acting on information that reached him Sunday night, had recalled them Monday morning. As it was, the tail of Early's column, marching westward on the road through East Berlin and Heidelsberg, had been less than 10 miles from the head of Stuart's own at the time he took the risky ditch jump near Hanover on Tuesday. In fact, the foot soldiers had heard the guns of that brief engagement, but had not investigated because Lee, despite his repeated warning to Stuart to be on the lookout for Ewell, had neglected to warn Ewell to be on the lookout for Stuart, with the result that the cavalry's roundabout Hejara was prolonged for 2 more days, including some 30-odd hours beyond the opening of the battle, which in turn resulted from Lee's groping his way across the Pennsylvania landscape, deprived of his eyes and ears, as he said, and with little information as to the enemy's whereabouts or intentions. Because that 10-mile gap had been ignored, not only ignored but unsuspected, whatever Lee encountered, good or bad, was bound to come as a surprise, and surprise was seldom a welcome thing in war. And so it was. Coincidence refused to mesh for the general who 6 weeks ago in Richmond had cast his vote for the long chance. Fortuity itself, as the deadly game unfolded move by move, appeared to conform to a pattern of hard luck. So much so, indeed, that in time men would say of Lee, as Jael had said of Sisera after she drove the tent peg into his temple, that the stars in their courses had fought against him. Such information as he had, and it was meager, had come to him not from Robertson or Jones, whom Stuart had left to guard the Blue Ridge passes, nor from Jenkins, who was off with Ewell, but from a spy. Scout was a euphemistic word, sent out some weeks before by Longstreet with instructions to pick up what useful tips he could in the lobbies and barrooms of Washington. His name was Harrison, and no one knew much about him except that he was a Mississippian, bearded and of average height, with sloping shoulders, pale hazel eyes, and an abiding dislike of all Yankees. Lee, for one, apparently considered him unsavory and declined at first to see him when he was brought to Shelter's Woods that Sunday night. "I have no confidence in any scout," he said. Informed by a staff officer, however, that Harrison claimed the Federal Army had crossed the Potomac, which Lee could scarcely credit in the absence of any such report from Stuart, he changed his mind and sent for him shortly before midnight. Travel-stained and weary, the spy told Lee that he'd been in Frederick that morning, having heard in Washington that Hooker had transferred his headquarters to that place. Arriving, he had found it true. At least 2 corps were there, he said, and others were in the vicinity, with 2 more pushed out toward South Mountain. After observing all this, he'd procured a horse and ridden hard for Chambersburg to report to Longstreet, who had sent him on to Lee. Incidentally, he remarked in closing, Hooker had been replaced that day by Meade. Lee reacted fast, as well he might, to this news that the Blue Army had been for the past 2 days on the same side of the Potomac as his own, one of whose corps, in addition to being divided itself, was 30-odd miles away from the other 2, which were threatened in turn by a possible movement against their rear. It was not so much that he feared for his supply line. He was prepared to abandon contact with Virginia anyhow. The trouble was, if the Federals crossed South Mountain and entered the lower Cumberland Valley, as Harrison had claimed they were about to do, and as Hooker in fact had intended, they would force Lee to conform in order to meet the threat to his rear and thus deprive him of the initiative he had to retain if he was to conduct the sort of campaign he had in mind. In the absence of his cavalry, moreover, the dispersed segments of his army were in danger of being surprised and swamped by overwhelming numbers. Meade, in short, might do to him what he'd planned to do to Hooker, defeat him in detail. What was called for in the face of this was a rapid concentration of all his forces, preferably east of the mountains, so as to compel the enemy to abandon the threat to his rear. Orders designed to effect this went out promptly. Ewell was instructed to give up his advance on Harrisburg and return at once to Chambersburg with all 3 of his divisions. Hill and Longstreet, who had just been alerted for a northward march to the Susquehanna, were told to prepare instead for a move on Cashtown, 18 miles to the east and just beyond South Mountain. The former would start today, it was morning by now, June 29th, the latter tomorrow, which would keep the single road from being clogged. On second thought, and for the same purpose of avoiding a jam, Lee sent a follow-up message to Ewell suggesting that he remain on the far side of the mountains and march directly to Cashtown or Gettysburg, another 8 miles to the east. Simultaneously, couriers hurried south to urge Robertson and Jones to leave the Blue Ridge and join the army in Pennsylvania as soon as possible. A 7th Brigade of Cavalry, under John B. Imboden, assigned to Lee for use on the invasion, but so far only used to guard the western approaches to the lower Cumberland Valley, was also summoned. But since it would be at least 2 days before these horsemen could get to Chambersburg, Lee told Longstreet to leave 1 division behind to protect the trains until Imboden arrived. Meanwhile, the rest of the army would converge on Cashtown, from which point it could threaten both Washington and Baltimore, thus retaining the initiative by forcing the enemy to turn back east or remain there in order to keep between the Gray invaders and those 2 vital cities. All this had been arranged within 8 hours of Harrison's report to Lee, but neither the spy nor anyone else could tell him anything of Stewart, who had vanished as if into quicksand. However, an officer arrived from the south that morning reported that he had met two cavalrymen who told him they'd left Stewart on June 27th, all the way down in Prince William County, on the far side of Occoquan Creek. Lee was startled to hear this, having learned from Harrison that Hooker had begun to cross the Potomac 2 full days before that time. Though he kept up a show of confidence for the benefit of subordinates, General, the enemy's a long time finding us, he told the division commander. If he does not succeed soon, we must go in search of him. Lee was obviously disturbed, and he kept asking for news of Stewart from all callers, none of whom could tell him anything. One more item concerned him, though few of his lieutenants agreed that it should do so. They were saying that Meade was about as able a general as Hooker, but considerably less bold, and they were exchanging congratulations on Lincoln's appointment of another mediocre opponent for them. Lee, who had known the Pennsylvanian as a fellow engineer in the old army, did not agree. General Meade will commit no blunder on my front, he said, and if I make one, he will make haste to take advantage of it. While Longstreet marked time in Chambersburg waiting for Hill to clear the road on which his 3 divisions were proceeding east to Cashtown, Ewell began his southward march from Carlisle. Greatly disappointed by the cancellation of his plan to occupy the Pennsylvania capital, which he saw as a fitting climax to the campaign that had opened so auspiciously at Winchester, and continued for the next 2 weeks as a triumphal procession through one of the most prosperous regions of the North, Old Baldhead was puzzled by the apparent indecisiveness of his chief. Jackson's orders, enigmatic though they often were, had always been precise and positive, whereas Lee had not only reversed himself by ordering a return to Chambersburg, he had also modified this further by changing the objective to Cashtown or Gettysburg and leaving it up to the Corps commander to choose between the two. Unaccustomed to such leeway, which Jackson had never allowed him on any account, Ewell deferred making a final choice until next day, when he would reach Middletown, aptly named because it was equidistant from both of those alternative objectives. Sending word for Early to head west from York, and taking up the southward march himself with Rhodes, while Johnson came along behind with a spoils-laden wagon train, he was also nettled by Lee's additional instructions that if at any point he encountered what he judged to be a large force of the enemy, he was to avoid a general engagement, if practicable, until the other 2 corps were at hand. This seemed to Ewell a plethora of ifs, and he fumed under the added burden of responsibility, not only for the safety of his corps, but also for the safety of the army, in a situation which, for him at least, was far from clear. Much as he missed his amputated leg, he missed even more the iron guidance of the man under whom he'd been serving when he lost it. Those same precautionary instructions had gone, of course, to Hill, who was known to have little caution in his makeup. His policy, throughout his year of service under Lee, beginning with the attack that opened the 7 days offensive, which he'd started rolling for the simple reason that he could no longer abide the strain of standing idle, had been to pitch into whatever loomed in his path with little or no regard for its strength or composition. This had stood the Confederacy in good stead from time to time, especially at Cedar Mountain, where he'd saved Stonewall from defeat, and at Sharpsburg, where he'd done the same for Lee, whose reference to him in the official report of that battle, and then A.P. Hill came up, had become a byword in the Army. Little Powell was the embodiment of the offensive spirit here in Pennsylvania as well as back home in Virginia, and so were the troops of his command, who took a fierce pride in the fact. Completing the march to Cashtown that first day, Heath's division went into camp while the other 2 were still on the road, and hearing that Early's men had overlooked a supply of shoes while passing through Gettysburg the week before, Heath sent his lead brigade forward next morning, June 30th, to investigate the rumor. Its commander, Johnston Pettigrew, mindful of Lee's warning not to bring on a battle until the whole army was at hand, prudently withdrew when he encountered Federal troopers along a creek bank west of town, not knowing what number of blue soldiers of all arms might be lurking in rear of the cavalry outpost. He returned to Cashtown late that afternoon, having put his men into bivouac about midway between there and Gettysburg, and reported on the day's events. Heath did not think highly of such weariness. What was more, he wanted those shoes. So he took Pettigrew to Hill and had him repeat the account of what he had seen. Hill agreed with Heath. The only force at Gettysburg is cavalry, he declared, probably a detachment of observation. Meade's infantry forces were still down in Maryland, he added, and have not struck their tents. Heath was quick to take him up on that. If there's no objection, he said, I will take my division tomorrow and go to Gettysburg and get those shoes. None in the world, Hill told him. One strenuous objector was there, however, in the person of John Buford, a tough Kentucky-born regular with a fondness for hard fighting and the skill to back it up. And though Hill was strictly correct in saying that the only bluecoats now in Gettysburg were cavalry, Buford's 2 brigades were formidable in their own right, being equipped with the new 7-shot Spencer carbine, which enabled a handy trooper to get off 20 rounds a minute, as compared to his muzzle-loading adversary, who'd be doing well to get off 4 in the same span. Moreover, in addition to having 5 times the firepower of any equal number of opponents, these 2 brigades were outriders for the infantry wing under Reynolds, whose own corps was camped tonight within 6 miles of the town, while those under Howard and Sickles were close behind him. Meade had set up Army headquarters just south of the state line at Taneytown, about the same distance from Reynolds as Reynolds was from Gettysburg, and all but one of his 7 corps, Sedgwick's off to the east at Manchester, were within easy marching distance of the latter place. He was, in fact, about as well concentrated as Lee was on this last night of June. The Confederates had the advantage of converging on a central point. Ewell at Heidelsburg and Longstreet in rear of Cashtown were each about 10 miles from Gettysburg, and Hill was closer than either, whereas the Federals would be marching toward a point that was beyond their perimeter. But Meade had the advantage of numbers and a less congested road net. Plus another advantage which up to now, except for the brief September interlude that ended bloodily at Sharpsburg, had been with Lee. The Northern commander and his soldiers would be fighting on their own ground in defense of their own homes. His march north today and yesterday, after the day spent getting the feel of the range, had been made with the intention, announced to Halleck at the outset, of falling upon some portion of Lee's army in detail with the full strength of his own. His main point, he said, was to find and fight the enemy, since in his opinion the attitude of the enemy's army in Pennsylvania presents us the best opportunity we have had since the war began. But this morning, receiving information that the enemy are advancing probably in strong force on Gettysburg, he had begun to doubt that that was really what he wanted after all. Much oppressed with a sense of responsibility and the magnitude of the great interests entrusted to me, as he wrote his wife, he'd begun to think that his best course would be to take up a strong defensive position covering Washington and Baltimore, and there await attack. It was his intention, he declared in a circular issued that afternoon, to hold this army pretty nearly in the position it now occupies until the plans of the enemy shall have been more fully developed, adding that it was not his desire to wear the troops out by excessive fatigue in marches and thus unfit them for the work they'll be called upon to perform. He found what he considered an excellent position along the south bank of Pipe Creek, just to the rear of his present headquarters at Taneytown, and he had his engineers start laying it out on the morning of July 1st, planning to rally his army there in case Lee came at him in dead earnest. The commanding general is satisfied that the object of the movement of the army in this direction has been accomplished, he announced in another circular, viz. The relief of Harrisburg and the prevention of the enemy's intended invasion of Philadelphia, etc., beyond the Susquehanna. It is no longer his intention to assume the offensive until the enemy's movements or position should render such an operation certain of success. If this was reminiscent of Hooker in the Wilderness, Meade went fighting Joe one better by making it plain that every corps commander was authorized to initiate a retirement to the Pipe Creek line, not only by his own corps, but also by the others in the event that the rebels made a lunge at him. The time for falling back can only be developed by circumstances. Whenever such circumstances arise, as would seem to indicate the necessity for falling back and assuming this general line indicated, notice of such movement will be at once communicated to these headquarters and to all adjoining corps commanders. That was a long way from the intention expressed 2 days ago to find and fight the enemy. But the fact was, Meade had already lost control of events before he made this offer to abide by the decision of the first of his chief subordinates, who took a notion that the time had come to backtrack. Even as the circular was being prepared and the engineers were laying out the proposed defensive line behind Pipe Creek, John Reynolds was committing the army to battle a dozen miles north of the headquarters Meade was getting ready to abandon. And Reynolds, in turn, had taken his cue from Buford, who'd spread his troopers along the banks of another creek just west of Gettysburg. Willoughby Run, it was called. By daylight of July 1st, he later reported, I had gained positive information of the enemy's position and movements, and my arrangements were made for entertaining him until General Reynolds could reach the scene. Buford was all business and hard action, now as always. A former Indian fighter, he drove himself as mercilessly as he did his men, with the result that he would be dead within 6 months at the age of 37 of what the doctors classified as exposure and exhaustion. Convinced now that the fate of the nation was in his hands here on the outskirts of the little college town, the Kentuckian was prepared to act accordingly. A journalist had recently described him as being of a good-natured disposition, but not to be trifled with. A singular-looking party with a tawny mustache and a little triangular gray eye, whose expression is determined, not to say sinister. The night before, when one of his brigade commanders expressed the opinion that the rebels would not be coming in any considerable strength, and that he would be able to hold them off without much trouble, Buford had not agreed at all. No, you won't, he said. They will attack you in the morning, and they will come booming, skirmishers 3 deep. You will have to fight like the devil until supports arrive. That was how they came, 3 deep and booming. Heath was on his way to get those shoes. In the lead today, by normal rotation of the honor, was the Alabama Brigade of Maryland-born James Archer, a Princeton graduate who had discovered an aptitude for war in Mexico and had gone on to become a U.S. Army captain and now a Confederate brigadier at the age of 46. Archer had fought in every major battle under Lee from the 7 days through Chancellorsville, where he led the charge on Hazel Grove that broke the back of the Federal defense. Hill had fallen sick in the night and was confined to his tent in Cashtown this morning, too weak to mount a horse. But with Archer out front, he would have all the aggressiveness even he could desire, as was presently demonstrated. Though Pettigrew had warned him the previous evening that he was likely to run into trouble short of Gettysburg, Archer moved his Alabamians rapidly eastward down the Chambersburg Pike until they topped a rise and came under fire, first from the banks of a stream in the swale below, and then from the slopes of another north-south ridge beyond, on whose crest a 6-gun battery was in action at a range of 3/4 of a mile. That was about 8 o'clock. Archer ordered up a battery of his own, and while it took up the challenge of the guns across the way, he shook out a triple line of skirmishers, textbook style, and prepared to continue the advance. But Heath, who had come to the head of the column by now, decided to make doubly sure there'd be no further delay. He called up a Mississippi brigade commanded by Joseph R. Davis, put it on the left of Archer north of the Pike, and sent them forward together down into the shallow valley that was floored with the shimmering gold of ripened wheat fields. The 2 brigades started downhill through the standing grain, the skirmishers whooping and firing as they went. Just as the Deep South had led the way to secession, Alabama had been 4th and Mississippi 2nd among the original 7 states to leave the Union, so was it leading the way into the greatest battle of the war that had been provoked by that withdrawal.